engine running.
Absolute genius.
Get this.
Welcome.
This is the show where we bring you
Science.
What that essentially means is
Discoveries.
Advances.
Questions. Research.
technology.
Unbelievable.
Without further ado,
This is The Naked Scientists. Hello, welcome to the Naked Scientists podcast. This is the show that brings you the biggest breakthroughs and talks to the major movers and shakers in the worlds of science, technology and medicine. With me, Chris Smith. And coming up, an Ebola outbreak in the DRC. What's behind it and what's the risk? Also, NASA reveals plans for next year's Artemis III launch, which is a step closer to setting foot back on the moon. And a bit later on, how an ice vest helped overweight volunteers to shed a kilo. The World Health Organization has declared an Ebola outbreak in the Democratic Republic of the Congo a public health emergency of international concern, with more than 100 reported deaths in the east of the country and potentially, according to some studies, over 1,000 people infected. The cause is a more recently discovered form of the Ebola virus called Bundibugyo. After an incubation period of some 10 days or so, the virus causes high fevers, an intense inflammatory reaction known as a cytokine storm, and because it also attacks blood vessels, the virus depresses the ability of blood to clot, leading to bleeding all over the body, hence the term hemorrhagic fever. The mortality rate is between 20 to 50%, and because all body fluids are infectious, it is relatively easy to transmit in crowded conditions with poor medical facilities, and especially where public awareness of the threat is poor. A highly mobile population, rapid transport routes internationally, and porous borders with nearby regions mean that the spread can be fast. Cases are already being reported in neighbouring Uganda. Tom Kizak is the Director of Biocontainment at Galveston National Laboratory at the University of Texas Medical Branch.
The virus is undoubtedly what's called a zoonosis, or a virus that exists in some animal, and the index case catches it somehow from whatever that reservoir is. It's highly suspected that bats are the natural host, and then people who are exposed to the excreta of bats, or also bats are used as a food source in some areas of the world. And then most of the transmission occurs from one person to another. And it's what's known primarily as a bloodborne agent, so that you require very close contact. And furthermore, it's only during the latter stages of the disease, when the individual is quite sick, when that transmission occurs.
And the mechanism of disease?
Well, it's what's called a hemorrhagic fever. Part of it is that the immune response gets out of control and also contributes to how serious the disease is. So it's not altogether the virus that's making you sick.
The outbreak we're seeing now, what's that? Because they're saying that's not the same as the form that surfaced in 2014, caused that big outbreak.
There have been, subsequent to the original 1976 outbreaks, a number of these viruses discovered. This one is called Bundibugyo, after a town in western Uganda where there was an outbreak that was relatively small that occurred in 2007, 2008. And that lends its name towards this virus. The subsequent single outbreak that occurred after that in 2012 over in the DRC was also relatively small. So our experience with this particular virus is not particularly broad.
There was a claim that, and the World Health Organization, Professor Ghebreyesus has said today, that this may well have been spreading for an extended period of time because it was somewhat flying under the radar, because we were looking for one form of Ebola and potentially missing this one.
Yeah, if you go back to the 2014 outbreak, unfortunate circumstances were somewhat similar. In other words, the diagnosis of this as an Ebola and the measures that need to be put in place to keep it as a small outbreak just didn't happen, partially because specimens in the 2014 outbreak weren't presented to a laboratory that could do the diagnosis. And this one, there was some inability to recognize this particular strain in the initial attempts to diagnose it.
Some suggestions and some modelling, including numbers published by Imperial College in London this week, suggest that in fact the outbreak may be far larger than people had anticipated, and therefore it's gathering momentum faster and it could go farther afield. Why do these things tend to grow and spread like that? And what's the end point? How do we get control of this?
Primarily through public education and also having medical facilities identify cases early on and take care of them with appropriate personal protective gear. Because again, if you are exposed to the secretions and excretions of somebody who's become seriously ill with that, that's the primary means of transmission. So identifying patients and getting them out of situations where their family members or medics that don't have the appropriate protective gear taking care of them, that's what needs to be avoided, and that's how it needs to be brought under control. If there were vaccines, they could practice something called ring vaccination. But in the 2014 outbreak, you may recall that there were vaccines brought to bear, but it was so late in the outbreak, it actually did not have that much to do ultimately with the control and the cessation of that outbreak.
Do we have vaccines against this one?
Well, there's some potential that the Zaire vaccine might have some effectiveness, but it's not going to be something you want to depend upon to probably bring this outbreak to an end. And the sort of demonstration that it's effective is really not there at the moment.
Are there no drugs that we can use against Ebola viruses?
And I would say that's really not well known at the moment.
Why is this happening at all? Because it feels like we're seeing more of this happening more often to more people.
The reservoirs tend to be out in the bush, and populations of humans are expanding into some of those areas. And not only that, but means of transportation among different population centers has improved vastly. So let me back up and say it might have in the past occurred and not spread as rapidly as this one appears to be spreading now, because ability to move through the areas where the virus initiated the first infections in humans was not what it is today. The global concern is that you can get on an airplane in Kinshasa or Kampala or Entebbe and be someplace else on the other side of the earth within, a matter of hours.
Tom Kizak, who's Director of Biocontainment at Galveston National Laboratory, the University of Texas Medical Branch. Well, up into space now, and following last month's successful Artemis II mission, NASA has started looking at plans to launch Artemis III. Earmarked for next year, the launch is proposed to be the last planned step before landing humans on the moon. Richard Hollingham took me through it. He's from the Space Boffins.
Artemis III is the next stepping stone to the moon. Originally, Artemis III was going to be the landing on the moon, but now it's a test of the landers in low Earth orbit. Now, this all sounds great, and you sort of assume, oh, they've got the landers to test. They haven't got the landers to test. So there are two landers being built right now, one by Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos' company, and the other is being developed by SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's company. So when it comes to landers, it really is a sort of battle of the billionaires here about whether they can get them made in time so this rocket can launch into Earth's orbit, not to the moon, just in Earth's orbit, and dock with these landers, test them out, test out things like spacesuits, operating, docking, all those sorts of things.
Well, hang on a minute. If they're a lander and they've got to land on the moon, haven't you got to go to the moon to test a moon landing?
Well, again, this goes back to what they did with the Apollo missions, and it makes a huge amount of sense. Going to the moon is incredibly risky. So during the Apollo missions, you had Apollo 7, which was just a test of the spacecraft in low Earth orbit. You had Apollo 8, the famous mission that orbited the moon, very much like what we've just seen with Artemis II. And then the mission that's often forgotten, which is Apollo 9. And that was a test of the Apollo spacecraft with the lander for the first time in low Earth orbit. It was practicing things like docking, like transferring astronauts between the two. And so they could be confident that when they actually took the lander to the moon, it was going to be able to operate perfectly. So it does make a whole lot of sense. This time it's going to be multiple launches. So potentially with Artemis III, and this has never been done before, they will launch the astronauts into orbit, as we saw with Artemis II. They will launch separately 2 different landers on 2 different rockets. In fact, you've got 3 different types of rocket in action here. They'll launch the SpaceX lander and the Blue Origin lander into low Earth orbit, and Orion will dock with both, and potentially astronauts will move between each of the landers. The clock is very much ticking on this because they're saying it's going to be in 2027. So even if it was the end of 2027, you're kind of looking at about 18 months to get this done.
Why is there no lander yet then? What's the delay?
This has been held up, multiple times. Different decisions made about landers and which way to go. Originally, it was going to be just SpaceX, and if you look at a lot of the graphics on the NASA website, that was the original plan. Then it looked like SpaceX weren't going to do it in time, so they reintroduced Blue Origin, who had been there at the early stages of a competition to develop a lander. I mean, both are very sophisticated, both are new technology, particularly with the SpaceX lander. It's enormous, and it would be a huge step change, whereas the Blue Origin looks not dissimilar to that sort of spidery Apollo lander that we're all kind of familiar with when you see those pictures of the astronauts on the moon. It is bigger, but it's more traditional sort of lander territory, like a lot of the robotic landers. Whereas SpaceX is part of Elon Musk's very ambitious plan to ultimately take people to Mars. So it's all part of his Starship system, which hasn't yet got into orbit. But if it all succeeds, then, it really is in the same way that, SpaceX has really changed the economics of space, made it so much cheaper. This would be a real step change in the kinds of technology. And all the while this clock is ticking, you've also got the competition, which Jared Isaacman, the new head of NASA, has also been talking up over the last few days, the competition between the US and China. He said in a speech a few days ago that he believed that China would plan next year to send astronauts out around the moon, so very much like Artemis II. So that would put China only about a year behind the US in returning astronauts to the moon. I mean, there is a political element to this, ramping up the tension. We want money to do this is kind of the message. But, that's at the back of many minds in NASA as well.
If there are now 2 lander contenders, they're not going to send both, presumably. So does this mean that whichever one performs best in these tests will be selected as that's going to be what goes to the moon?
They're not framing it that way, certainly at the moment. They're just saying, we are doing Artemis 3, we are testing these landers in orbit. But yeah, you'd assume that both can't go to the moon. But maybe one would go on one mission on Artemis 4, another would go on Artemis 5 or something like that. Because they're being launched separately, I mean, potentially you could actually send both to the moon. None of this has been made clear yet. This really does seem to be, we're kind of witnessing a plan taking shape in real time. This is a very different plan to what was there, 5-6 years ago when these landers were first commissioned. I don't know the answer to that question.
Let's assume then that Artemis 3 goes to plan. Both of these things work, so NASA has a choice. And then the next step will be the lunar surface, presumably. So Artemis 4 will be the landing. When is that earmarked for, if all goes to the current time plan?
If all goes to the current time plan, and it isn't now an accelerated plan, we're looking at Artemis 3 in 2027 and Artemis 4, so the return to the moon, so astronauts on the surface of the moon in 2028.
Richard Hollingham from the Space Boffins on what NASA has in mind for Artemis 3.
The Naked Scientists podcast is produced in association with Spitfire, cost-effective voice, internet and IP engineering services for UK businesses. Find out how Spitfire can empower your company at spitfire.co.uk.
Music in the programme is sponsored by Epidemic Sound, perfect music for audio and video productions.
This is the Naked Scientist podcast with me, Chris Smith. Still to come, how ice vests might be one way to lose a bit of weight. But first, the United Arab Emirates has called a drone strike near its only nuclear power station a dangerous escalation and blamed Iran or one of its proxies for the recent attack. The Gulf nation's infrastructure has been targeted by thousands of drone and missile strikes since the start of the wider conflict in the Middle East a few months ago. It echoes attacks on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear station by Russia in the early stages of the war in Ukraine. Malcolm Grimston is an honorary senior research fellow at Imperial College London.
First thing to say is obviously nuclear power stations are extraordinarily robust. They're designed to deal with both internal and external threats. So in other words, something going wrong inside the reactor and protecting the outside environment if that happens. But equivalently, anything outside the environment which is trying to get in. So we've seen, for example, in Ukraine, where the Zaporizhzhia nuclear reactor has been right in the firing line of the war there, but has not been breached. There's been no radioactive emissions from that. And I thought it's unlikely that the aim was actually to try and produce radioactive emissions because they can go anywhere and whoever's doing it, the danger is it ends up blowing over their own territory. So at the moment, it's quite difficult to understand quite what's going on here, I think.
Although, notwithstanding that latter point, we do know that these facilities do have Achilles' heels because while Fukushima withstood an amazingly powerful earthquake perfectly well, as it was designed to do, it was the tsunami inundating the diesel backup generators that then caused the disaster. Just because the power station's robust, there could be other ancillary infrastructure that isn't so.
Yes, and it's also worth remembering, though, that during the earthquake and tsunami in 2010, it was only the oldest plant, Fukushima 1, that wasn't able to withstand the tsunami. All of the other nuclear plants up and down the coast, which were subject to the tsunami, were able to come through without any significant damage and certainly no release of radioactivity. So I think using a 1970s plant, which met the most unbelievable conditions, that it was able to withstand an earthquake actually rather larger than the design was meant for. Of course, one should never be complacent, but it doesn't look to me that if you really wanted to damage a nuclear plant, I don't know how you'd do it. I think external threats have never been terribly successful. And indeed, it's noticeable how few terrorist attacks there have been on nuclear stations, simply because I think people recognise they're so difficult to breach.
Is it then that people are just trying to put the wind up people? We know that nuclear scares people, so it's a way of putting the wind up people, getting attention for yourself. Is that really what's behind this kind of thing?
Although it's the first nuclear station in the United Arab Emirates, the UAE has said that it intends to develop nuclear energy, in part so then it can use its fossil reserves for exports rather than using them at home. And if you are working in a plant which is subject to a lot of drone attacks, then quite independent of what type of plant it is, it's going to be a threat to the workforce. It's going to disrupt the orderly operations of the nuclear reactor, but it could be any sort of plant or facility. So I wonder a bit whether this is just a generalized attempt to undermine the infrastructure. And of course, although the nuclear plant itself may be safe and radioactive releases may be unlikely, you can still damage the wires that take the electricity from the plant to where it's going to be needed. And so you can debilitate, even though you're not actually damaging the radioactive parts.
Why does the UAE think Iran is behind this particular attack?
The tensions within the Middle East among the various countries, almost as they seem to be battling for hegemony of the Arab world. It's such we've seen a number of cases where now the Iranians have been blocking UAE's access to the Straits of Hormuz so they can get their fossil exports out. UAE traditionally has been rather more accommodating and positive in its relations with Israel than has been the case with Iran. So it looks as if it's an ongoing part of the very, very complex military situation in the Gulf.
Was it that the nuclear station was an accidental hit then? Were they actually just going for something else and hit that? Or is this just a pattern of disruption, just to cause tension, cause stress and make a point?
I don't think there's much evidence that they were aiming for something else and ended up striking it, which in the case of Zaporozhye in Ukraine, it seemed to me damage that was done, and there was some damage to the ancillary plant at Zaporozhye. But that was largely collateral damage by the fact that the plant happened to be right in the line of the Russian line of attack into Ukraine. Here, it does seem to be, from what we can tell at the moment, a deliberate attack upon the plant. Though, as I say, there's a difference between saying it's a deliberate attack on the plant and that it's an attempt to get a radioactive incident, because simply, if they were successful in taking offline a major electricity generator like this, that of itself would have economic consequences for the UAE.
Malcolm Grimston at Imperial College London. Well, move over fat jabs, because researchers in the UK and in the Netherlands has found that wearing an ice vest could help people to lose weight. The small proof of concept study asked a group of overweight individuals to don the garment for a couple of hours each morning over a 6-week period. The aim was to use the cold stimulus to boost metabolism and burn more calories in heat-generating tissue called brown fat. The subjects lost nearly a kilo during the study. Michael Simons is Professor of Developmental Physiology at the University of Nottingham and co-led the study.
We were focusing on a particular fat known as brown fats, which is very different to white fats in that it's present in much smaller quantities and it's able to generate rapidly very large amounts of heat, 300 times more heat per unit mass than any other tissue in the body. And although we may only have 100, 200 grams of that fat, because of its potential to produce large amounts of heat rapidly, it could be a target for weight loss. And we also know that one of the major stimuli of brown fat is cold. For example, it's switched on in the newborn following cold exposure. So we wanted to know whether daily artificial cold exposure, could that result in a reduction in their body weight. So the aim was to get 50 volunteers, half male, half female, wearing a vest with ice packs in it for 2 hours a day for a 6-week period.
What did you actually measure? Did you see a demonstrable effect in body temperature, for example, or do you expect that the ice packs, the contact with the skin, is all that you need to make the body, or fool the body into thinking it's much colder than it is, and that's what triggers the brown fat?
We didn't see a major change in actual temperature, but I mean, as you summarised there, we were hoping to make the body feel there was a cold challenge, and that may therefore stimulate their brown fat metabolism. We did take blood samples to look at glucose metabolism, lipid metabolism, and inflammatory markers. And for that, we saw no obvious change. We did look to see whether we could see shivering, and that didn't seem to be apparent.
Was this a sort of beginning and an end body weight? Compare people before the experiment and after the experiment?
So we use bioimpedance to look at body weight and the relative amount of fat and muscle in the body at the start and at the end of the study.
And what did you find?
So we found that there was a significant 0.9 kilo reduction in white fat mass, and there was no change in muscle mass.
So it does look like it's a real phenomenon then. They lose weight.
That's what the data is suggesting at the moment. I mean, and also these were people that were overweight and obese, so they have higher body weight anyway. So in terms of actual their percentage fat loss, it's relatively small, but it's encouraging that we saw that to start off with.
Indeed, but sustained over a longer period of time, that would translate into quite a reasonable amount of body weight loss, wouldn't it?
Potentially. So that's why we're excited by it.
Do you know what drove the mass loss, though? Was it purely along the lines of your hypothesis? You were gearing up the brown fat, you were burning off calories, and that's why the weight went down? Or did this have some effect on behaviour? Did it make the people eat less, for example? Because we know when you put people in studies, they tend to cooperate with the study and they tend to go along with what the aim of a study is. So you tend to find some effect just because they're in a study.
That's possible. We didn't rigorously measure food consumption over the 6-week period, because if you make too many demands on volunteers, you can have problems getting people being recruited. And in terms of was brown fat being activated, it's quite difficult to actually measure whether brown fat is being switched on, because the gold standard of measuring brown fat is to look at the uptake of radiolabeled glucose, which obviously is not ideal. So that's ongoing studies that we're waiting to complete.
Any difference between the men and the women in the study? We know women do tend to have a different distribution of white fat in the body and a different sensitivity to cold compared to men. Studies in offices have shown that. Did they respond the same, though, to the cooling treatment here?
We need to do further analysis, but we've got 12 men, 12 women, so it may actually be underpowered to show a significant difference between sexes.
And time of day when you did this stimulation? Because we know that people's metabolism changes considerably across a day as well. Is there a sweet spot when you do this? You probably will get the best driving of your brown fat.
That will be future steps. At the moment, this was just a proof of concept to see whether wearing the vest for several weeks could have an effect on body weight.
Do you think, and I'm asking you to speculate wildly here, do you think what you're getting at with this is why we're seeing a trend in increasing body weight in the population anyway? Because we now do lead much cushier lives. People's houses are centrally heated. Talk to some people, they used to grow up with ice on the insides of the windows. They had to scrape off to see out on cold winter mornings. No one has that except, I think, me in my ancient house these days. So is it the environment that we're in that's helping and perhaps reversing this effect that you're seeing, which helps to explain some aspects of why we're growing larger as a population?
Oh, absolutely. You just look to see how our lifestyles, both our diets, unhealthy food that we eat now, but we also live in thermally insulated houses with central heating switched on in every room in the house. And of course, with climate change, global temperatures have increased 1.5 degrees C, and that there's interesting epidemiological data from the United States with the rise in temperatures in various states and an increase in the incidence of diabetes. So I think all these factors potentially increase our body weight and lead to the 30% plus incidence of obesity we're seeing across many countries on the planet.
Michael Simons at the University of Nottingham. Well, that's it for today. Do tune in on Tuesday, though, when we're going to be examining the latest AI developments, including an AI scientist, which will allegedly help researchers to spot the gaps in our knowledge where opportunities might lie to make the next big breakthrough and possibly get a Nobel Prize, who knows. Before we go, thank you to all of you who are continuing to support us with your donations. This really does make a difference, and I can't emphasise and underpin enough how grateful we are for your help. If you appreciate what we do for you every single week here on The Naked Scientist, do please head over to nakedscientist.com/donate and help us out there. I'm Chris Smith. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to write to me in the meantime, it's chris@thenakedscientist.com. Meanwhile, thanks for your company, and until we're together again, goodbye.